Here I am again, in the name of the sovereign creator of heaven and earth, the Lord Jesus Christ. Continuing with the historical evidence for preservation, I will now discuss the stream of transmission. What sort of a picture may we expect to find in the surviving witnesses on the assumption that the history of the transmission of the New Testament text was predominantly normal? We may expect a broad spectrum of copies showing minor differences due to copying mistakes, but all reflecting one common tradition. The simultaneous existence of abnormal transmission in the earliest centuries would result in a sprinkling of copies, helter-skelter, outside of that mainstream. The picture would look something like Figure A. The manuscripts within the cones represent the normal transmission. To the left, I have plotted some possible representatives of what we might style the irresponsible transmission of the text. The copyists produced poor copies through the people has produced poor copies through incompetence or carelessness, but did not make deliberate changes. To the right, I have plotted some possible representatives of what we might style the fabricated transmission of the text. The scribes made deliberate changes in the text for whatever reasons, producing fabricated copies, not true copies. I am well aware that the manuscripts plotted on the figure below, or in this case, the figure you're looking at, contain both careless and deliberate errors in different proportions. 7Q548 and Papyrus 52, 64, and 67 are too fragmentary to permit the classification of their errors as deliberate rather than careless, so that any classification such as I attempt here must be relative and gives a distorted picture. Still, I venture to insist that ignorance, carelessness, officiousness, and malice all left their mark upon the transmission of the New Testament text, and we must take account of them in any attempt to reconstruct the history of that transmission. Those with some knowledge of textual criticism may wonder at my placing Codex W at 200. The history of the place where W was found suggests that it must have been copied before AD 200. It was found in the ruins of a town that was abandoned in 200, when its water dried up. That town is in an isolated area surrounded by desert. Since W shows Byzantine influence, that text type already existed in the 2nd century. As the figure suggests, I argue that Diocletian's campaign had a purifying effect upon the stream of transmission. In order to withstand torture rather than give up pure manuscripts, you would have to be a truly committed believer, the sort of person who would want good copies of the scriptures. Thus, it was probably the more contaminated manuscripts that were destroyed in the main, leaving the purer manuscripts to replenish the earth. The arrow within the cones represents family 35. Another consideration suggests itself. If, as reported, the Diocletian campaign was most fierce and effective in the Byzantine area, the numerical advantage of the Byzantine text type over the so-called Western and Alexandrian text types would have been reduced, giving the latter a chance to forge ahead. It did not happen. The Church in the main refused to propagate those forms of the Greek text. What we find upon consulting the witnesses is just such a picture. We have the majority texts, so-called by Kurt Aland, or the traditional text, called by John Bergen, dominating the stream of transmission with a few individual witnesses going their idiosyncratic ways. In Chapter 4 of my Identity 4, I demonstrate that the notion of text types and recensions, as defined and used by Hort and his followers, is gratuitous. Epp's notion of streams fares no better. There is just one stream, actually a river, with a number of small eddies along the edges. When I say that the majority text dominates the stream, I mean it is represented in about 95% of the manuscripts. Actually, such a statement is not altogether satisfactory because it does not allow for the mixture or shifting affinities encountered within individual manuscripts. A better, though more cumbersome, way to describe the situation would be something like this. 100% of the manuscripts agree as to, say, 50% of the text. That's 50% of the words. 99% of the manuscripts agree as to another 40% of the text. Over 95% agree as to another 4%. Over 90% agree as to another 2%. So up to now we have 96%. Over 80% agree as to another 2%. Only for 2% or so of the text do less than 80% of the manuscripts agree, and a disproportionate number of those cases occur in Revelation. I am not prepared to defend the precise figures used. They are guesses, but I believe they represent a reasonable approximation to reality. And the membership of the dissenting group varies from reading to reading, which is a significant consideration. Still, with the above reservation, one may reasonably speak of up to 95% of the extant Greek manuscripts belonging to the majority textual tradition. I see no way of accounting for a 95% or a 90% domination unless that text goes back to the autographs. Hort saw the problem and invented a revision. Harry Sturz seems not to have seen the problem. He demonstrates that the Byzantine text type is early and independent of the Western and Alexandrian text types, and like von Soden, he wishes to treat them as three equal witnesses. But if the three text types, so-called, were equal, how could the so-called Byzantine ever gain a 90 to 95% preponderance? Just in passing, a text produced by taking two text types against one would move the United Bible Society text about 80% of the distance from where it is toward the majority text. In passing. Going on, the argument from statistical probability enters here with a vengeance. Not only do the extant manuscripts present us with one text form enjoying a 95% majority, but the remaining 5% do not represent a single competing text form. The minority manuscripts disagree as much or more among themselves as they do with the majority. For any two of them to agree so closely as do Papyrus 75 and Codex B is an oddity. Let me stop and explain that just a minute. Those two manuscripts agree 78% of the time where there is variation. Now for Alexandrian manuscripts, that is super good. That's the best. No other pair comes close. Codex B and Codex Aleph agree less than 70% of the time. For a Byzantine manuscript, anything less than 90 is so bad you just don't, you're out of the ballpark. So you see that when we have a very significant difference between so-called Alexandrian manuscripts and Byzantine manuscripts. Going on, we are not judging, therefore, between two text forms, one representing 95% of the manuscripts and the other 5%. Rather, we have to judge between 95% and a fraction of 1%, comparing the majority text with the P75B text form, for example. Or to take a specific case. In 1 Timothy 3:16, some 600 Greek manuscripts, besides the lectionaries, read God, while only 9 read something else. Of those 9, 3 have private readings, and 6 agree in reading who. So we have to judge between 98.5% and 1%. God versus who. It is hard to imagine any possible set of circumstances in the transmissional history sufficient to produce the cataclysmic overthrow in statistical probability required by the claim that who is the original reading. This doesn't work. There are many other arguments, but let's go on. It really does seem that those scholars who reject the majority text are faced with a serious problem. How is it to be explained if it does not reflect the original? Hort's notion of a Lucianic revision has been abandoned by most scholars because of the total lack of historical evidence. The eclecticists are not even trying. The so-called process view has not been articulated in sufficient detail to permit refutation, but on the face of it, that view is flatly contradicted by the argument from statistical probability. How could any amount of process bridge the gap between B or Aleph and the Textus Receptus? But there is a more basic problem with the process view. Hort saw clearly and correctly that the majority text must have a common archetype. Recall that Hort's genealogical method was based on community of error, on the hypothesis that the majority text is a late and inferior text form. The large mass of common readings which distinguish it from the so-called Western or Alexandrian text types must be errors, which was precisely Hort's contention. And such an agreement in error would have to have a common source. The process view fails completely to account for such an agreement in error on that hypothesis. Hort saw the need for a common source and posited a Lucianic revision. Scholars now generally recognize that the Byzantine text type must date back at least into the 2nd century. But what chance would the original Byzantine document, its archetype, have of gaining currency when appeal to the autographs was still possible, if it was a separate invention? Candidly, there's only one reasonable explanation for the majority text that has so far been advanced. It is the result of an essentially normal process of transmission, and the common source for its consensus is the autographs. Down through the centuries of copying, the original text has always been reflected with a high degree of accuracy in the manuscript tradition as a whole. The history of the text presented above not only accounts nicely for the majority text, it also accounts for the inconsistent minority of manuscripts. They are remnants of the abnormal transmission of the text, reflecting ancient aberrant forms. It is a dependence upon such aberrant forms that distinguishes contemporary critical or eclectic editions of the Greek New Testament and the modern translations based upon them. I wish to explain that although I have used of necessity the term text type in some of my writings, I view the majority text as being much broader. It is a textual tradition which might be said to include a number of related text types, such as von Soden's Ka, Ki, and Kl. I wish to emphasize again that it is only agreement in error that determines genealogical relationships. It follows that the concepts of genealogy and text type are irrelevant with reference to original readings. I will repeat that. It follows that the concepts of genealogy and text type are irrelevant with reference to original readings. They are only useful when employed properly for identifying spurious readings. Well, if there is a family that very nearly reflects the original, its profile or mosaic of readings will distinguish it from all other families, but most of those readings will not be errors. The competing variants distinctive of other families will indeed be errors. So far.